She walked in between two sharply dressed men, eyes darting, hands trembling around a glass of water she never drank. No one noticed. No one cared. Except for one man, an old veteran sitting alone by the window. He saw her scratch her wrist 3 times. He saw the spoon placed just so, and he knew exactly what it meant. Could this silent signal save her life? Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The sun hadn't yet risen over Ashton, Oregon, but Maple Junction Cafe was already breathing. Warm light spilled from the windows. The smell of fresh coffee and baked scones curled into the chill morning air like a promise. Inside, Evelyn Carter moved behind the counter with the rhythm of someone who knew every inch of the place. At 32, she'd worked the morning shift here for almost a decade. She knew how every regular took their eggs and who preferred silence over small talk. At exactly 6:45 a.m., the bell above the door gave its usual polite jingle. Evelyn didn't even have to look. She knew it was him. Frank Halstead, always punctual, always alone. He wore the same brown canvas jacket, a dark wool cap pulled low, and boots that still squeaked faintly on the tile no matter how dry the weather. He moved like someone who had spent a lifetime avoiding noise. "Morning, Frank," Evelyn said softly, as he took his seat at the far end of the counter. He gave her a slight nod, then placed a $5 bill on the countertop. No words, just the usual gesture. Black coffee, no room. She poured it before he even asked. Some of the newer waitstaff had tried small talk with him. Didn't work. But Evelyn had learned that silence could be its own kind of conversation. And in that silence, Frank Halstead always paid attention. The cafe filled slowly. Truckers, teachers, a tired nurse from the night shift. Frank stayed in his seat, sipping slowly, eyes occasionally drifting toward the windows. He always sat facing the door. Old habits, maybe. At 7:03 a.m., the tone of the cafe shifted. Not loud, just off. Evelyn noticed at first in the way a group of linemen near the front suddenly stopped laughing. Then the way the kitchen quieted for half a second longer than usual. The bell jingled again. 2 men walked in, sharp suits, clean-shaven, the kind of neatness that didn't belong in a place like this. Between them, wedged like an afterthought, was a teenage girl, maybe 18, wearing a light gray hoodie that hung awkwardly on her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, dark, and unsettled. She clutched her hands together tightly in front of her. "Table for 3, one of the men said. His voice was flat, controlled. He didn't smile. Evelyn pointed to an empty booth in the back. The girl sat between them, not across, not beside, between. That told Evelyn more than she wanted to know. Frank didn't turn his head, but he saw everything. The girl didn't speak, didn't open a menu, didn't look at the chalkboard where the specials were listed in big friendly letters. Her hands wrapped around a water glass like it was her only anchor. She wasn't drinking. One of the men ordered bacon, eggs, toast. The other asked for coffee. The girl said nothing. They didn't ask her. Evelyn approached the table, notepad in hand. "Anything for you, sweetheart?" she asked, offering the girl a gentle smile. The girl looked up for half a second, eyes full of static. I'm not hungry," she mumbled. One of the men cut in. "She's fine. We'll share." Evelyn nodded and walked away, but her stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. Could this be a cry for help? Frank, still at the counter, lifted his mug. He took a slow sip. Then he blinked once. He'd seen it. The girl had just scratched her left wrist 3 times, then set her spoon gently across the edge of the table, diagonally handle pointing toward her lap. It wasn't random. Frank Halstead had spent 30 years studying silent signals. He knew the difference between a twitch and a cry for help. He watched her hands closely. She lifted her glass again, still untouched. This time, she tilted it slightly toward the window before setting it down again, a third signal. This wasn't a coincidence. Frank set his mug down. No hurry, no alarm, just like in Kandahar in '03 or Panama back in the day. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flip phone. Nothing fancy, no apps, just signal. He typed 5 words into a text, then sent it to a contact named Red Hawk. That was all he needed. The response would come across the room. Evelyn was stacking dishes at a nearby table. She glanced toward the booth. The girl caught her eye just for a moment. Evelyn saw it now. There was a thin line of panic behind those eyes, barely held back. She hadn't imagined it. Frank stood up. He walked to the counter, leaned in slightly, and spoke just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "Tell Mark, I want a red sunrise, no sugar." He didn't blink. Evelyn froze for half a breath. "That wasn't a drink order." "Got it," she said softly. She turned toward the kitchen and disappeared behind the swinging door. Frank returned to his seat, back straight, eyes forward. Behind the scenes, Evelyn found Mark Jennings, the cafe's owner, pouring batter onto the griddle. He looked up and saw her face. "What's wrong?" He said, "Red sunrise, no sugar." Mark didn't ask questions. He walked to the back office, picked up the landline, and made a quiet call to the sheriff's department. Didn't even use a name, just coordinates, a protocol they hadn't used in nearly 20 years. Back in the dining area, the 2 suited men were leaning in toward each other, whispering. Their tone had changed. The girl stayed silent, her hands now flat on her lap, still waiting. Frank checked the windows. There was no panic in him, just calculation, just silence. He'd learned long ago that fear never helped. Preparation did. The girl shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. Another signal. That one was newer, but he'd seen it before. It meant urgency. Now Frank made one more move. He grabbed a sugar packet from the tray in front of him, stood up, and walked slowly toward the back counter. Not toward them, just enough to be seen. As he passed the edge of their booth, he dropped the sugar packet. It landed right beside the girl's foot. She looked down, then looked up. Her eyes found his, and in that exact second, she nodded. Just once. That was enough. Frank Holstead didn't need more than that. He picked up the sugar, slipped it into his pocket, and walked back to his table. Evelyn returned from the kitchen. She moved like normal, carrying plates, refilling water, but her eyes met Frank's, and he gave her the smallest shake of the head. Not yet. The room settled back into itself. Forks scraped plates. The coffee machine hissed, but under the surface, something had shifted. There was tension in the air now, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Natalie Grant sat between 2 men who never looked at her, but she had been seen. And Frank H. Halstead, the quiet old man who never talked, was already preparing to bring her home. Whether they knew it or not, Frank Halstead didn't look like he was doing anything out of the ordinary. His hands moved with the kind of slow precision that never drew attention. But under the counter, he flipped open his old gray flip phone and tapped out a code. 7 digits, no names, no explanation, just a message known only by a handful of people still walking the earth. It went to Jake Collier, now a lieutenant at the Benton County Sheriff's Department 30 years ago. Jake had followed Frank through jungle and ash and fire. Today, he would follow him again, no questions asked. Frank closed the phone with a soft snap, then raised his mug and took a long, steady sip. His face gave nothing away. To the other customers in the cafe, he looked like any other retiree sipping his morning brew. But inside his mind, Frank was building a battlefield. He scanned the cafe again. 1 entry, 2 exits, 1 through the kitchen, 1 marked employees only near the bathrooms. Booth layout gave limited cover. Too many civilians still inside. No direct action unless absolutely necessary. He'd waited half his life to never need those skills again. But when evil walks through the front door, instinct doesn't ask for permission. At 7:09 a.m., Frank stood. He walked casually toward the counter where Evelyn Carter was refilling the sugar station. He didn't speak until she looked up. Then, in a voice quiet enough to stay between them, he said, "Red sunrise. No sugar. You remember that code?" Evelyn froze. Her hands stopped mid-motion, hovering over the sugar jar. She stared at Frank for a full second. Then her breath caught. Red sunrise. She'd heard that phrase only once. From Mark. It wasn't a drink. It was an emergency phrase from his days in special operations. She nodded. Just barely. I remember. Frank stepped back to his booth, sat down like nothing had happened. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, then moved toward the kitchen. Her pulse had quickened, but her face stayed calm. Just another waitress going about her shift. In the back, she found Mark Jennings flipping hash browns on the grill. She leaned in and whispered, "Frank just ordered a red sunrise." Mark didn't speak, didn't ask what she meant. Instead, he grabbed a towel, wiped his hands, and walked to the office. There, behind the closed door, he reached beneath the register and pulled open a hidden panel in the counter. Inside was a terminal, outdated, slow, but secure. He typed in a 10-digit code, followed by the GPS marker for Maple Junction Cafe. A confirmation light blinked green. The message would ping the local emergency line with high-priority alert, silent, untraceable, marked as Red Sunrise Level 3 High-Risk Hostage Code. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned to the front, heart pounding. She didn't look toward Frank, but she knew he was watching, waiting. Back at the booth, the two men were growing impatient. One was scrolling his phone, glancing toward the windows. The other leaned toward the girl. Natalie still hadn't touched her water, but she hadn't moved either. Frank shifted his seat ever so slightly. From that angle, he could now see under the table. The girl's shoelaces were untied on purpose. Left shoe tucked behind her right ankle, toe pointed outward. That wasn't a mistake. It was an old escape code used in P training. Frank's expression didn't change, but now he knew the girl wasn't just in trouble. She was trying to buy time. She was trained or someone had taught her well. That made things both better and far more dangerous. He took out a pen from his jacket pocket, tore a corner from a napkin, wrote 3 words: window, wait, signal. Then he stood up again. This time he didn't walk to the counter. He walked toward the coat rack, hung his jacket slowly, slipped the napkin into the inside pocket of a spare fleece Evelyn kept on the hook behind the bar. He made sure she saw it. When he walked past her station again, Evelyn glanced at the jacket. Understood. Frank returned to his booth and sat down. The clock read 7:16. He didn't need to look at it again. The response time for Red Sunrise was 11 minutes at most, as if on cue. The bell over the door jingled. A man in a navy blue hoodie and faded jeans stepped inside. Mid-30s, ball cap, quiet energy. He took a seat by the window, ordered nothing. Another came in 2 minutes later. Sweatpants, running shoes, earbuds, sat near the restroom. 2 more followed. It was subtle, but to someone like Frank, it was loud and clear. The response team was in position. Not tactical gear, no flashing lights, just quiet professionals. One of them brushed past Evelyn's station and gave her a soft tap on the counter. 1 beat, 2 beats. She turned slightly toward Frank and gave a half nod. He saw it. Everyone was in place. Frank reached for the sugar shaker, spun it once, then stopped it with his fingertip face down. Final go signal. He turned his eyes to the girl. She was sitting straighter now. Natalie noticed the man at the window. Then the jogger. She exhaled slowly for the first time since she'd entered. Her shoulders dropped by half an inch. Frank picked up his coffee, raised it slightly like a toast only she could see. Natalie blinked once. The first man at the booth leaned closer to her again, whispered something. She flinched. Frank's fingers tightened slightly around the cup, then relaxed. No sudden movements. Not yet. Behind the counter, Evelyn slipped her hand into the jacket pocket and retrieved the note. She walked over to Mark, handed him a napkin, and whispered, "She's ready." Mark nodded. He walked out from the kitchen, holding a tray of fresh muffins. He approached the booth casually. "Morning, folks," he said. "We've got a fresh batch on the house." One of the men barely looked up. "We're fine." But Natalie looked right at him, and then with deliberate slowness, she tapped her glass twice, then slid it toward the edge of the table. The second man grabbed her wrist. That was the mistake. Frank Halstead stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He walked straight toward the booth, every step measured. By the time the man noticed, it was too late. Frank was beside him. "Let go of her," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped the entire room. The man stood halfway, confused. That's when the undercover officers moved. The man near the window pulled a badge. The jogger drew cuffs. 2 others blocked the exit. Chaos didn't break. It was contained like it had all been rehearsed. The man holding Natalie let go, but it was too late. Natalie bolted straight toward Evelyn, who opened the side door to the kitchen. Gone. Safe. Frank stepped back. Let the officers do the rest. One of the men tried to resist. A mistake. Within seconds, both were cuffed, faces down under the quiet weight of practiced force. Natalie peeked from the kitchen. Evelyn held her gently. Frank watched, then picked up his jacket, put on his cap. The sirens hadn't even arrived yet. He walked toward the door. Evelyn called out softly, "Frank?" He paused, turned slightly. "Thank you," she said. He gave her a small smile, then nodded once, and just like that, he was gone. Outside, the wind had picked up. Morning light spilled across the street, and the town of Ashton kept breathing, unaware that one of its ghosts had just saved a life. Again, outside, the world moved as if nothing had changed. Cars rolled down the main road. A school bus turned the corner. Birds flicked across the sky. But inside Maple Junction Cafe, time had narrowed to a single thread. Frank Halstead sat still, watching. 2 plainclothes officers were already in position, one near the window, pretending to read a newspaper, the other by the restroom, checking his phone with purposefully slow movements. Frank scanned the cafe one last time. 5 customers still eating, 2 servers behind the counter, Evelyn near the coffee machine, trying to breathe like everything was normal. The 2 men in suits, seated with Natalie, leaned in again. They were speaking too softly for anyone else to hear, but their posture had changed. Tense, alert. Frank stood up. He moved like a man stretching after a long sit. No hurry, no tension. He picked up his coffee mug, walked a few steps, and then spilled it. The cup slipped from his fingers and hit the tile with a sharp crack. Hot coffee splashed across the boots of the man closest to him. "Damn," Frank muttered, voice just loud enough to carry. "Sorry about that," the man cursed and shot up, brushing at the dark stain on his pants. His chair screeched against the floor. Frank didn't flinch. He bent to pick up the mug, and with that motion, he subtly blocked Natalie from their line of sight. It was all the time Mark needed. The cafe owner emerged from the kitchen with a clean dish towel draped over his shoulder. He stepped up to the booth like he was offering hospitality. "Miss, looks like you got some on your sleeve, he said, eyes gentle but firm. "You want to come in back and rinse it off?" Natalie hesitated for half a second. Then she stood. No sudden movement, no noise. She followed Mark toward the swinging door without a word. The man nearest her turned just in time to see her disappear into the kitchen. His hand twitched, but before he could move, a badge flashed. The plainclothes officer by the window stood and calmly said, "Benton County Sheriff's Department. Don't move." The second officer was already behind the booth. The men's reaction was instant, but so was the response. One lunged for his jacket. The other tried to pivot. They didn't get far. The first officer caught the closer one in a wrist lock and twisted him down to the floor. The other was shoved hard into the booth, handcuffed in a single fluid motion. No shouting, no weapons drawn, just practiced clinical efficiency. Frank stepped back and let them work. His hand stayed in plain sight. His eyes never left Natalie's booth. The other customers began to stir, confused, but Evelyn moved quickly, smiling gently, voice calm. "Folks, everything's all right. Might be a good time to take a coffee to go," she said. On the house, within seconds, the front of the cafe began to clear. No panic, just quiet departure. In the kitchen, Natalie stood frozen near the sink. Mark had handed her a towel, but she hadn't moved. Her breath came in short bursts like she'd just run a mile. Evelyn stepped in and knelt down next to her. "It's over," she whispered. "You're safe now." And just like that, the tears came. Natalie dropped the towel and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with every breath. "I tried," she said between sobs. "I tried to get someone to notice. I scratched my wrist. I did the spoon thing. I waited 3 days." "I know," Evelyn said, wrapping her arms around her. "I know, honey, but he saw. He saw you." Natalie's voice cracked. "I didn't think anyone would." The kitchen door swung open gently, and Mark peeked in. "It's all handled," he said softly. "Sheriff's pulling up now. They won't get close to her again." Natalie turned toward Evelyn. "Who was he?" she asked. "That old man. He just knew." Evelyn looked through the narrow window in the kitchen door. Frank was gone. She felt her throat tighten. "He's someone who's been watching for a long time," she said quietly. "And he doesn't miss a thing." Outside, sirens finally echoed in the distance. The uniforms would arrive now, late, but expected. The plainclothes officers were already walking the two suspects outside in handcuffs. No resistance left in them. One of the men snarled, "You don't even know who we work for." But the officer didn't answer. He just kept walking. Frank's footsteps didn't echo. He didn't speak to anyone. He crossed the street, hands in pockets, wind tugging gently at the hem of his coat, and he disappeared into the morning. No medals, no handshakes, just the same silence he'd always carried. Back inside the cafe, Natalie was now sitting in the staff chair near the pantry, a cup of tea in her hands. Evelyn crouched next to her. "You've been through something no one should ever face," she said, "but you're not invisible. Not anymore." Natalie looked up, eyes red but steady. She nodded. "I thought if I disappeared, no one would notice." Evelyn smiled. "Well, someone did. He noticed everything." She took Natalie's hand gently. "You're not going anywhere but forward from here." Natalie gripped the cup tighter. "Do you think he'll come back?" Evelyn hesitated. Then she looked toward the seat where Frank always sat. The cup he'd left behind still sat empty, a thin ring of black at the bottom. "I don't know," she said, "but I think he only shows up when someone needs him." Mark stepped in from the kitchen, holding Frank's folded receipt. "He left enough to cover everyone's breakfast," he said, shaking his head, "and even left a note." He handed it to Evelyn. Scrolled in sharp handwriting were 4 words. She signaled, "I listened." Evelyn blinked, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her apron. A quiet story was already beginning to form. Outside, police tape went up. Names were taken, witnesses interviewed, but the man who mattered most had already left. No one even knew his name. Later that afternoon, one of the responding deputies walked back into the cafe and approached Mark. "You said the old guy who tipped you off. What's his name?" Mark looked down for a moment, then shrugged. "Never gave it. But he sits there," he said, pointing to the stool by the window. "Same time every day. We just call him Frank." The deputy narrowed his eyes. "Frank Halstead." Mark blinked. "Yeah, you know him." The deputy nodded slowly. "I've read his file." He didn't say more, just looked again toward the door where Frank had vanished. "Tell him thanks," the deputy said quietly. "If he ever comes back," Mark smiled faintly. "We don't tell Frank what to do. He just shows up when the timing's right." Across the cafe, Evelyn wiped down Frank's seat carefully, respectfully. The stain from the spilled coffee was still drying on the floor, but nobody moved to clean it. It felt like something sacred. By the time the cruisers rolled in and the uniforms filled the cafe, Frank Halstead was already gone. He'd left behind a crumpled 20 under his empty cup, a folded receipt, and the faint trace of coffee on the floor. No one saw him slip out the front door. There was no handshake, no medal, no name exchanged. Just a quiet retreat into the gray Oregon morning, as if he'd never been there at all. But the silence he left behind didn't last long. That evening, after the cafe closed early, Mark sat at one of the corner booths with his laptop. He hesitated, then opened the Maple Junction Cafe Facebook page and began to type. He didn't dramatize the events, didn't name the suspects. He just told the truth. A girl had come in with two dangerous men. She signaled for help the only way she knew how, and one man had noticed. "We serve a lot of folks here," the post read. "But today, one of them saved a life without saying a word. If you ever see an older man in a brown coat sitting by the window, know that you're safer than you realize." He ended the post with the 4 words Frank had left behind. "She signaled. I listened." By midnight, the post had over 3,000 shares. Comments flooded in, some from nearby, some from veterans halfway across the country. And then came the messages, direct, personal. One from a retired Navy corpsman in Montana, another from a former Army Ranger in Georgia. All of them had heard the name before. Frank H. Halstead, a former SEAL team leader known for hostage recoveries and impossible extractions, reportedly vanished from public life in the late 1990s. He was said to have walked away after one final mission went sideways. Details sealed. The team disbanded. Some thought he died. Others believed he had simply had enough. But now he had surfaced, just for a moment. And then he was gone again. Could this be the last we hear of Frank? A week later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Evelyn arrived at work early. The morning light spilled across the cafe floor in long golden lines. The scent of cinnamon rolls baked slowly from the kitchen. She opened the drawer below the counter, pulled out a small black frame, and set it gently by the window. Inside the frame was a black and white photo, an older image, grainy but clear. Frank Halstead, much younger in uniform, standing in front of a downed helicopter with 4 men behind him, all smiling, all alive. Next to it, a small brass plate bore the words, "For the ones who don't wait for orders, they just act." No big ceremony, no announcement, just respect. The regulars noticed. Some left folded dollar bills beneath the frame. Others left challenge coins, quiet nods from fellow veterans. And every morning after that, Frank's seat remained empty. But it never felt abandoned. A few days later, Natalie returned to the cafe. She wore a soft green sweater and jeans. Her hoodie was gone. So were the shadows under her eyes. Evelyn greeted her with a warm hug. Mark gave her a gentle nod. She didn't say much, didn't need to. She rolled up her sleeves and began wiping down tables without being asked. She worked slowly, deliberately, like she was rebuilding something inside herself, one napkin holder at a time. Natalie had been placed into a specialized recovery program for trafficking survivors. She had a counselor now, a safe home, a name that someone finally cared to remember. But every morning she still came back to Maple Junction Cafe. Sometimes she helped fold napkins. Other times she scribbled specials on the chalkboard in careful handwriting. And when things got quiet, she would drift toward the window seat, Frank's seat. She never sat in it, but she would rest her hand on the edge just for a moment, as if to say thank you, as if to remind herself that someone had once seen her exactly when the world hadn't. One afternoon, as Evelyn was polishing silverware, Natalie approached with a small box. Inside was a patch, a Navy SEAL trident, old, faded. She'd found it tucked into the back of the jacket Frank had spilled coffee on. She hadn't even realized he'd placed it there. "Do you think he left it for me?" she asked. Evelyn looked at the patch, then back at her. "I think he left it for whoever needed to remember what bravery looks like." Natalie smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. She placed the patch next to the framed photo on the windowsill. After that, more stories came. A woman from Bend, Oregon, wrote in saying she'd once seen Frank help an injured dog limp across a highway, then vanish before she could thank him. A man from Spokane recalled a stranger stopping him from getting into a cab one night. That cab was later found abandoned after a robbery. The description of the stranger matched Frank exactly. Piece by piece, a legend rebuilt itself, not from medals or news reports, but from quiet stories that had once gone untold. The sheriff's department never gave a public statement, but officers who visited the cafe often took their coffee by the window. One of them brought his son in one Saturday morning and pointed to the photo. "He's why I joined, he said. Natalie overheard that, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't just smile. She laughed. That seat by the window never stayed empty long. Not in spirit. Frank Holstead never returned, but his presence never left. One morning, months later, a man in uniform walked in and asked Evelyn if the old guy who used to sit by the window still came around. Evelyn shook her head gently. "He doesn't come here anymore," she said. "But you can feel him, can't you?" The soldier nodded. "I heard what he did. That girl, she reminded me of my sister." Evelyn handed him a to-go cup already paid for. "Then take this one in his name," she said. "He'd like that." The soldier looked toward the framed photo. "God bless him," he whispered. Outside, the seasons changed, but Maple Junction Cafe stayed the same. And in the window, bathed in soft morning light, a picture of a quiet man in uniform reminded everyone who passed through that some heroes don't raise their voices. They raise their eyes, they pay attention, and when the moment comes, they act. Not for praise, not for glory, but simply because someone needed help. And they were the one who saw it. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.